Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. This is the Coping with COVID webinar series. We welcome you all. Over to Jayatma.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Wherever you are in the world right now, I hope that you are safe and you are well and that you are taking care of yourself and those who are around you. My name is Jayatma Vikramanayaka. I am the United Nations Secretary General's Envoy on Youth. I'm joining you from New York and I will be your host and moderator for this 1 hour. I'm delighted to welcome all of you to this very special episode of our Coping with COVID webinar series focusing on young people's mental health. And today we will be focusing on young people with disabilities and their mental health during COVID-19. This webinar series is organized by my office in partnership with UNICEF and WHO, and this episode is specially brought to you with the support of UNFPA and META, Latin American Network for Youth with Disabilities. Before we begin, I would like to share with you some important information about young people with disabilities. Estimates suggest that there are between 180 and 220 million youth with disabilities worldwide. Nearly 80% of them live in developing countries. While they often face the same challenges as any other young person, such as quality education, decent employment, healthcare, social services, for youth with disabilities, these issues are often more complex. Stigma, discrimination, and barriers to accessing information, technology, and their physical environment can exacerbate marginalization and exclusion for them. Other layers of vulnerability are added by factors like ethnicity, race, gender identity, sexual orientation, and belonging to minority groups. So today we will hear from young people with disabilities themselves on how they have experienced the COVID-19 pandemic, how they are living in this new normal, how they have been taking care of their mental health during this pandemic, and what they need from us, what they need from policymakers going forward. To ensure that this session is accessible to all, real-time captioning is available in English, French, Spanish, Russian, Arabic, Chinese, and Portuguese. Please follow the link in the chat to access this. International Sign and American Sign Language interpreters will also be supporting the accessibility throughout this webinar. Please use the grid view on Zoom to pin the interpreting window. Last housekeeping request, please switch off your cameras unless you are speaking, and please do stay with us till the end as we have planned an interactive question and answer session where you can ask your most pressing questions and send us your feedback and comments, and we also have a small but enlightening surprise for all of you. So without further ado, I would now like to introduce Niall DeMarco, a disability rights advocate, the first deaf contestant to win America's Next Top Model and Dancing with the Stars, who is sending us a video message all the way from Spain. Over to you, Neil.
As Jay mentioned, this is a tough time for everybody. In particular, youth with disabilities. They've remained outside of the scope of access to things like education, leaving them without many protections. With this pandemic, they're even more vulnerable. I also want to mention deaf kids born to hearing parents who don't know American Sign Language. It's especially tough for those kids who can't go to their deaf schools right now, where they would normally socialize with their peers, deaf students, and deaf teachers. But right now, they're back home around family who don't sign. This makes it tough for them too. I want those deaf kids to realize, though, that they could be the ones to teach their parents to sign, to take charge of the opportunity. What a great time for parents to learn ASL alongside their own child. This seems like an idea that could be fun and beneficial too. I also want to share what I'm doing to combat what's going on right now. In my time at home, I'm doing home workouts, watching movies, I'm catching up on a lot of movies, TV, there's a lot of TV that I'm behind on. Plus, there are always new shows coming out all the time. I've also been learning Spanish for fun. I figured, why not? When else will an opportunity like this come up? Of course, the list could go on forever. The last thing I'm going to mention is my social media channel. I've been doing a lot of educating the world on things like my deaf culture, my needs as a deaf person, what the deaf face as everyday struggles. It's important to take the time, with all of the time that we have now, to do something with it.
Thank you very much, Niall, for that very important message. Niall is an American model, actor, and a deaf activist, and we are so grateful that he could send us this very important video message and have his constant support for young people with disabilities. Now, I would like to introduce two young persons with disabilities from different parts of the world who have inspiring journeys to share with us. We will hear their reflections on the challenges they have faced in navigating the COVID-19 pandemic and how they strive to support their communities in spite of the barriers they face. Our next speaker is Gabriel Haredia, a 17-year-old young Argentinian with Asperger syndrome, who is a member of the Latin America Network for Youth with Disabilities, META, and the creator of the Asperger Chubut League. Gabriel, thank you so much for joining us. As a young advocate for the rights of persons with Asperger syndrome, can you please share with us how COVID-19 has affected you and your peers and how META members are supporting each other?
COVID-19 had an unexpected impact on all of us. At the beginning, it was very confusing. Some people have been through different states of mind, like sadness, burden, desperation, anxiety, and depression. Moreover, our routines were broken. Our plans changed, and the organization we had in our lives has been altered. These have been very hard months, and we are still learning to get used to this reality. I believe that during this time, the support of our families and keeping in touch with our peer groups were very important for vulnerable young people and children. This pandemic taught us to resist, to be creative, to have hope, to reflect on the world right now, to value what we have, to be responsible, to take care of each other, and it's also teaching us the worth of solidarity, friendship, and family. Firstly, Meta Network was born in 2013. It groups young people with and without disabilities from Latin America. It is a network committed to create a more inclusive society. Meta seeks to promote human rights, fights discrimination, and works to develop inclusive and equal opportunities for everyone in every country. I have been in touch with Meta Network since last year. We support each other and we are looking to create fun virtual activities sharing our cultures and knowledge. We carry out virtual projects such as games, talks, and share educational videos. All of this helped us to make our group stronger, to get to know each other better, and to understand the problems from different regions so as to think about ourselves collectively. I think we still have a lot of work to do, and we are helping each other in this process. We try to keep positive, hopeful, and strong.
Thank you very much, Gabriel, for that message. We look forward to having you join us live later in this session as well. Now I would like to call upon our next speaker, Surya Sahetape. Surya is an Indonesian deaf advocate and social media influencer who fights for the rights of deaf people in Indonesia and globally. He is a student at Rochester Institute of Technology, National Technical Institute for the Deaf, and has come a long way in advancing access to sign language for young deaf people. Surya speaks ASL and will be using an interpreter today. Surya, thank you so much for joining us. I would like to ask you first, as an advocate for young deaf people and as a social influencer, how has COVID-19 impacted you and the broader deaf community?
Thank you. Yes, COVID has presented quite a challenge for us. With regard to my own personal experience, it certainly was an overwhelming amount of information at the beginning to understand how to protect my own health. In Indonesia, there was a survey of a consortium of disability organizations that showed that people with disabilities have experienced impacts to their life. 80% of the people surveyed indicated that economically or in other ways they've been impacted. A good friend of mine even lost their job. Other surveys have shown that deaf people struggle with getting online access to classes because of COVID-19 changes. We surveyed 15 organizations, or rather of the 15 universities in Indonesia, we found that students struggled with connectivity, access, interpreting, a lack of interpreting, and a lack of captioning access. Parents who have deaf children have also been overwhelmed in knowing how best not only to communicate through the sign language barriers, but how to support their children. Access to television in Indonesia depends on the local government. Some local networks provide interpreters or captions, many do not. As many events switch to an online venue, that means companies and governments providing webinars are challenged to do so, and often they fail to provide interpreters or captionings. And I'm sure that people in other countries are experiencing those same challenges that we are here in Indonesia.
Thank you very much, Surya. If I could ask you a follow-up question, what would be your advice to young deaf people around the world who are watching you, who are following you, who are considering you as a role model? What advice can you give them in coping with the current coronavirus pandemic?
Sure. I think people should not be afraid to ask for help. If you have resources, reach out to friends, family, community members to offer ways you can help through various organizations. It's important that we work together. The deaf community has done that, has come together in ways that support education. For example, sharing information that the government has provided about health, about access. Information is being made in video form, with captions, not only about physical health, but mental health as well. For example, sign language is important. We're working with a Center of Sign Language in Indonesia to produce a video in sign language that can be shared as a resource. The content relates to COVID-19 and teaches children what it means, what's happening in the world around them, and how to protect themselves. We're also working with a team of deaf people to look at information that universities can use as to guidelines to improve their services and online access by providing interpreters and captioning services. So accessibility is hugely important. Access to information is important. As we know from the UN Convention on Rights with Peoples with Disabilities, all governments are responsible to ensure that people with disabilities have access to information and communication on par with any other citizen. So that means readers for blind people, or sign language interpreters for deaf people. Buildings must be physically accessible as well. So we all need to work together to ensure that education continues to be available to people regardless of their needs. We need to fight to overcome COVID together. Thank you for the interpreters, the captioning. We hope to see more access to sign language available in various languages, even Indonesian Sign Language here, just the same as we're able to offer it in spoken languages as well. Don't forget to wash your hands. Stay healthy and take care of yourselves, everyone.
Thank you very much, Surya, for those very important remarks. Now I'm going to go to our next segment, but before we start this session, I would like to inform the audience that we are opening now the Q&A function. So you can start posting your questions, you can start posting your comments, and if you have a question for a specific speaker in the lineup, please be sure to mention who your question is directed to, or if you want all our speakers to respond to your question, you can also ask a generic question that I can directly all the speakers. So feel free to flood our Q&A section with your questions, comments, feedback, and any ideas that you have that we can improve our work going forward for young people with disabilities. Now, for this next session, I would like to introduce two young women whose stories are very inspiring, and we are very keen to hear from them, their resilience, their strength, and the advice they can offer to other young persons with disabilities and to policymakers in these adverse times of COVID-19. I would now like to introduce Tobiloba Ajay, a young lawyer from Nigeria and the founder of the Let Cerebral Palsy Kids Learn Foundation, who was recently awarded with the Mandela Washington Fellowship for her work. Toby, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Firstly, as a lawyer and the founder of your organization, Let Cerebral Palsy Kids Learn Foundation, we would like to hear first about your journey, how you came to where you are today.
Okay, so my journey as someone who has cerebral palsy herself is a journey of, I would say, focus on the things you can do and not on the things that you can't. That's pretty much my attitude to living with a condition that's lifelong and affects the ability to use your muscles. It's just a choice to say, what can I do and how can I do that? And then how can I then find help for the things that I cannot do? So I can speak. So how can I use my voice to make a difference? I may not be able to walk around, but can I get someone to help me with things that require movement? So it's a focus on strengths while finding support for the things that are weaknesses. That's kind of how it's done.
Thank you so much, Toby. So in your work, you support over 350 families of children with disabilities to get education.
Yes.
I have two questions for you. First,
Okay.
what kind of support do you find that parents need most during this pandemic to work in partnership with their children? And secondly, what advice do you have for them on how to keep it together in these very adverse situations where learning is online, mobility is limited, and accessibility, for an example, technology is a constant challenge?
Right. So for the support, for a lot of parents, it's the biggest challenge is the lack of access to supportive care. So for a lot of parents, when schools were open, it was when children were in school, they had respite. So it meant that when the child went to school from say 8 to 2 p.m., the mother or the primary caregiver could take a break. The first thing that COVID took away was that respite time. So for a lot of parents, it's one of the big things that they are asking is, how do I get respite if I have to be the one to ensure that this child goes to school online, and then ensure that they get therapy, and then ensure that they get the care they need. So it's really a cry out for support in all the ways that allows them to get respite. Unfortunately, COVID makes that almost impossible because the children have to be at home with these parents. So for a lot of it, what we're saying to schools is that, can you find ways to make sure that you're supporting the parents of the children? Make sure that you're checking in with them. I mean, we're also checking in with them as an organization, but as a school, can you please try not to overwhelm parents? I mean, parents are not teachers. So please try not to overwhelm them with all of this work that you want the child to get done. Bear in mind that they have like a huge workload now that schools are closed. And so for parents, I mean, it's kind of like a follow-on from this first question. One of the things that I say to them is that it's okay to take a break. I mean, I've had parents who, looking at their circumstances, have basically said, look, your child is young enough that if they miss one term of school, it's not going to be catastrophic. So it's okay for your child not to be in online school right now. Your mental health is probably more important than your child doing this term of online school. So if they miss this term, it's okay. I mean, I say to parents, if you can't, I mean, if financially the cost of getting your child online is not something that's sustainable for you as a family, then don't stretch yourself to a point where you break down because you're trying to do it all. So it's basically about finding balance, find what works for you as a family, and ensure that you do that. Because also there is the parents are still dealing with the information overload about COVID. I remember when COVID started, one of the big questions was always, will this thing kill my child if my child catches it? I mean, I cannot remember the number of times
Toby, I think we are having some difficulties when it comes to hearing you. Do we still have you with us, Toby? I think technology got in the way, and hopefully we can have Toby back for the Q&A session. But if not, thank you so much for all the perspectives you shared with us all the way from Nigeria. Till Toby is back, I'm going to go to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Leah Labaki. Leah is a member of the European Network of Users and Survivors of Psychiatry and a former researcher at the Disability Rights Division at Human Rights Watch Belgium. Leah, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. And someone who has devoted her career to protect survivors of psychiatric institutionalization and working on disability rights. We would love to first hear about your own journey, about where you are today and what makes you so passionate about the work that you do.
Thank you, Jayatma. So I had difficulties with my mental health from quite a young age. And my first time in a psychiatric hospital was when I was 13. And I had really difficult experiences there, like being forced to take medication that completely knocked me out, being locked in an isolation room, or being tied to my bed. So basically throughout my teenage years, I lived in a sort of parallel world outside of society, not going to school and not having any friends. And then when I started university, I felt like a total alien, as I had to catch up with my peers while carrying this sort of dark secret about myself. But then finally, it was through the subject of my studies that I started feeling more empowered, because I decided to study human rights. And by chance, I ended up doing an internship on the rights of people with disabilities at Human Rights Watch. And that's where I finally connected the dots between my own traumatic experience in psychiatric hospitals and human rights. And I understood that I could raise my voice to try and end the kind of violations that I'd been through. So today I still struggle, I still have periods of crisis, but this human rights awareness has empowered me to better advocate for myself. It has taught me that there's nothing wrong with being who I am, that I have the right to get the support and accommodations that I need without being taken away from society and without having to give up my choices and my freedom.
Thank you so much. And based on this lived experience that you just shared with us, how can young people, and especially young people with disabilities, become more resilient? And what can society learn from the current crisis to become more inclusive in everything we do?
So, of course, the pandemic was distressing in many ways. But I think that for me, and probably for many other people with disabilities, it also felt like the gap between us and the rest of the world was reducing a little. So, for example, it was not my first time in forced isolation. Already when I was 13, I had to learn how to cope with an empty day alone in a small hospital room with nothing to do and no social contact. I knew I had to structure my days, escape through my imagination, and enjoy even the tiny things I could find. So I think many young people with disabilities were in fact better prepared for a lockdown than their peers because they have already been there. And in addition, this pandemic required from everyone a lot of adapting to a new situation that does not suit us. But as young people with disabilities, we're also masters of adaptation because we're constantly navigating a world that's not organized for us and having to make do with something that's not quite right. So in fact, we're way more flexible than we appear to be. And this pays off in times like these because it can make us particularly resilient. And then concerning people with psychosocial disabilities and all those who were already struggling with their mental health before this, we're usually seen as the crazy ones, right? We're usually thought to be wrong to feel and act like we do. And then suddenly there was a pandemic and everybody else went crazy and everybody was right. So I hope the fact that so many people experienced the thoughts and emotions that are familiar to us, like overwhelming anxiety or having doubts about the reality of things, I hope this can lead to more support and understanding for those of us who experience this on a more regular basis. I hope people will start listening to us more and will stop considering our distress as inadequate and senseless because we make sense too. And we're not just symptoms to be fixed. And another thing that society can learn from this crisis is that it's possible to change how things are done. Because as disability rights advocates, we always hear that it would be too complicated to change anything. We can't adjust how we teach to include kids with disabilities. We can't close institutions. We can't make our communication accessible. But when a pandemic came into play, countries around the world were suddenly able to make massive changes in how they function in a very short amount of time. And interestingly, some of these changes were among those that people with disabilities had been demanding for years, like accessing work and events like this one remotely, closing down some institutions or expanding psychological support. So the minute this benefited the majority, it all became feasible. So to sum up, I'd say that despite all the dramatic effects of this pandemic, I do have hope that it can act as a sort of catalyst to transform societies and make them more open and inclusive of people with disabilities.
Thank you very much, Leah. And I think it was a very powerful statement you made that we are not symptoms to be treated, that we are equal partners, that we have rights like everybody else, and we need to be included similarly in discussions, in initiatives that affect our lives. Thank you very much for sharing those very powerful reflections. Before we move on to our next segment, I would like to remind all participants that the Q&A function is now open. You can keep sending us your questions, your comments, your feedback. If you have anything to add to what our speakers have currently said, if you don't agree with something that we have said, you can also politely express that in the Q&A box, and we'll be more than happy to hear different perspectives and different viewpoints throughout our webinar today. We have also real-time captioning available in English, French, Russian, Spanish, Arabic, Chinese, and Portuguese. Our teams will put the link to these simultaneous interpretation, or rather the, what do we call it? The closed captioning. Sorry, I lost the word for a moment there. Our teams will put the link to the closed captioning as well for you to access. And we do have International Sign and American Sign Language interpreters in our session today who are supporting the accessibility throughout this webinar. So if you want to access those interpretation, please go to the gallery view in your Zoom so you can see multiple people on the screen, and that way you will be able to see your interpreters on screen as well. In this last section, now we are going into segment 4. I want to give the floor to 2 experts who will help us conclude this webinar, leaving us with some key tips to navigate the COVID-19 landscape better. So the first expert that I want to go to is Akiko Hart. Akiko is the CEO of NSUN, the National Survivor User Network in England. She's also the chair of ISPS UK, which advocates for social and psychological approaches to psychosis, and sits on the board of Hearing Voices Network England and National Voices. Akiko, thank you so much for joining us today. And I want to ask you, as the CEO of the National Survivor User Network and someone who has worked with youth for many years, in your opinion, what has the COVID-19 pandemic had on young people? What impact has the COVID-19 pandemic had on young people and their mental health?
Thank you very much. And first of all, thank you for inviting me. I think the crisis has had a mixed effect on young people and their mental health. On the one hand, and I think this has been a little bit of a theme of COVID has exposed inequalities and has made them worse. For many young people, being at home under lockdown has had a negative impact on their lives and their mental health, especially, for example, young people who are LGBTQ+ and who are not safe at home, or young people who live with interpersonal violence or abuse at home. Young people who are immunocompromised or who might not be able to leave their home once lockdown ends, they risk being forgotten as well. However, and I think Leah has just spoken to this point in a really powerful way, many young people who live with mental ill health and distress have also found that their coping strategies and survival skills have helped them over the last few months. The move to online has been positive for some people. I think it's a really complicated picture. For some young people, for example, being able to access remote peer support has been wonderful. If there isn't a group near where you live, or if you can't access your local group, then the move online has dramatically increased accessibility. But if you're digitally excluded, if you don't have privacy at home, if you can't afford data, then the move online might exclude you. Also, not everyone wants therapy online. So I think it's really complicated, and the solution won't be one size fits all. I think overall, it's very interesting that there's been a shift in policy to ensure a greater focus on young people's mental health during the next phase of this crisis. And I think it's our collective responsibility to hold policymakers, governments, and mental health services to account.
Thank you, Akiko. On that question, sort of building up in your answer, can I also ask, are there any platforms and resources that you recommend for young people living with disabilities to find support and to help them cope with the current uncertainties and the mental health challenges?
Sure, thank you. So I focused a little bit more on psychosocial disabilities or mental health, and obviously there are too many to mention, but I've kind of picked out a few which I'm hoping will be useful for people. And as I talk through them, hopefully they will be going into the chat so that people can pick them up, or perhaps it's the Q&A, I'm not sure which. So the first one I've picked is a resource from Hearing Voices Network England around surviving lockdown when you experience voices and visions. I think that's a very good one, so that should be coming up there. The next one I've picked is from a UK charity called The Mix, which is a piece about being worried about lockdown ending. And this is something that within NSUN we're picking up a lot from our members. You know, I think this transition phase is going to be difficult for a lot of people. The third one I've put in is again from The Mix, and it's their chat rooms, which are moderated safe spaces, so moderated by their staff or volunteers, and safe spaces for 11 to 25-year-olds to support each other. So hopefully that's coming up now. And finally, I've picked another charity called Student Minds, who have put together a series of mental health resources for students. So I hope that's helpful. What I will do as well, what I will do as well is I'll leave my email address in the chat or the Q&A, and if people want to contact me directly, that's fine as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Akiko. I was just going to say, as you were speaking, all the links appeared on the chat box, and I encourage everyone who is looking for resources to look at these links that are provided in the chat box. But also, if our UN colleagues could maybe also post the links in the Q&A section, that would be helpful as well, because I'm also finding it a little bit difficult at the same time navigating the chat box and the Q&A section. I'm sure it's the same for other young people as well. So we'll be sure to keep you posted on both ends. Now, we are going to the most interactive session of this webinar. We're going to take your questions and we're going to take your comments. And if you haven't posted your comments or questions, please post them now. We'll try to get them answered by our panelists and experts. If not, our teams behind the scenes, behind the keyboards, will actually be answering your questions in writing on the Q&A as well. So I'll go to the first question. Actually, this question is for Surya, but if anyone else of our speakers also want to contribute, please feel free to. This is someone from Indonesia. Do you think that job search for deaf persons with disabilities become more difficult during COVID? And I also see that there are a couple of questions on the same topic, basically looking at young people living with disabilities and their access to jobs and finding it difficult to enter the job market because of COVID-19. Since the question is from Indonesia, maybe Surya, you can start, and then I will pass on to anyone else in our panelists who would like to answer. Do we have Surya? I think he needs access to his video. Okay, there he is.
Thank you for this question. I would be happy to do some email and provide more specific information about that question here in Indonesia.
Thank you, Surya. You can also see the question on the Q&A box and direct your answers there as well. The next question is to Toby. I don't know if Toby is back. Do we have Toby back?
Yeah, I'm back.
Hi, Toby. Sorry we lost you earlier. So your sort of final closing remarks of the last question, please feel free to continue that as well. And there's a specific question for you from our audience. Can you elaborate on how to reach children with disabilities for remote learning? What are the challenges and opportunities?
Right. So again, disabilities is a very wide umbrella. So you have to be specific about what disability group are you reaching. In my organization, we work specifically with children with cerebral palsy, right? So these are children who will have difficulties with movement and posture. Parents to do is to first of all, to ensure that they continue to use the children's individualized education plans, right? So don't throw away the IEP because school is now online, and to find ways to hold those meetings online. So if you need to hold an IEP meeting, hold it over WhatsApp if you have to. Find what works for you. It doesn't have to be a Zoom meeting. If you don't have the bandwidth to do Zoom, use WhatsApp, use Telegram, use whatever works. Use short messaging service, even if that's what you can do. And then provide information to parents as to what you're trying to do. Provide it ahead so that parents can tell you, what resources home and what they don't have. And then just really be flexible. The parents cannot recreate the school setting in the house, okay? So be flexible as to what you are asking parents to do at home. And so I say to teachers, focus on what the big learning goal is. Stop trying to recreate the entire school day on Zoom or trying to recreate the entire school day online. What is the biggest thing that this child needs to learn today? They don't have to learn it between 8 a.m. and 2 p.m. If the parents can only make sure that learning happens between 5 and 7 p.m., then that's fine. Just make sure that you ensure that you're focusing on the big goals and then working with parents, because the truth is, parents can tell you what they have at home and they know their kids. They know what their family life is like and what can work for them. So depending on the whatever disability group that you're supporting to learn during this pandemic, make sure that you're working really closely with the resources. What do they have? What's their time constraint like? And making sure that you're not trying to overwhelm. Focus on the big goals and then just make that happen. Don't try to recreate the entire school day. It's not going to work that way. I hope that helps. If there are any other specific questions, I can try to ask them, and I can try to type in the chat box as well.
Thank you very much, Toby. I'm going through the very important questions that we are getting from our viewers. And a common question is, this is from a deaf advocate, how to talk to your parents during COVID. And I see some similar questions as well, saying that some parents do not support sign language, and there's always miscommunication with my parents, and I often feel angry about my parents, and I don't want to feel that way. How can I best communicate with my parents? How do I speak to my parents? This is a deaf advocate asking from us from, again, Indonesia. I wonder if any of our panelists would be interested in answering this question and helping their peers out.
This is Surya. Yes, I have had similar experiences. My parents knew sign language, but didn't want to use it in public. They felt society might look askance if we were signing in public, so they preferred only to sign at home. That's changed now. I was able to take my parents, who already knew some sign language, and introduce them to a community of signers and resources in that community, so that my parents could meet with other people, share experiences, and learn why they might choose to sign more often. If your parents refuse to learn to sign, I might suggest you try and introduce them to the community so they can broaden their perspectives.
Thank you very much, Surya, for those very valuable advice and sharing your personal experiences with us. Another question that we have got is that women and young women with disabilities often face violence, and they are more vulnerable because of their gender and violence against women and girls. How can we make sure that young women and girls living with disabilities are protected and empowered during pandemics and crises like this? If any of the speakers would like to answer, the floor is now open. I don't see any hands going up, so I think we will get the answers from our UN colleagues. Will probably answer that question in the chat box and get you the answers and resources that you need. Another common question is that many young people, because of school closures and lack of mobility and lack of access to internet and technology, many young people are facing challenges when it comes to accessing education during the pandemic. And this can leave lifelong consequences. The losing out on education can leave lifelong consequences for young people. What are some things that we can do to increase access to education for young people with disabilities during this pandemic? Any of our speakers? Dido, I see you
Hello.
coming up. Would you like to answer that question?
Yes, I would like to.
I have a few thoughts around that.
Sorry, 1 second. Toby?
So the thing is I always say, is to include.
I think Toby is on a loop. If we could mute her. Great, thank you. Sorry, Dido, about that technical difficulty. Please go ahead.
Okay, so basically I would like to address the both questions because currently I'm working with young persons and young persons with disability. I'm blind myself and I'm a psychologist. So basically how we support young girls who are girls or young women or you know, with young people with technological issues. We support them simultaneously, like we support them like we support young girls and women, plus like we support people with disabilities, plus like we support people who have troubles getting to connection or getting to internet data or any kind of connection. So we have to do all the things that are bothering people with disabilities, because from the work that I see partially with people with disabilities and partially with young people as a general target group, we need to work on all the things that make the people vulnerable. So if we support someone solely like a girl or a young woman and not support her as a person with disability, we are not doing the thing that we need to do. We need to do all the things that bother and that hinder this person's ability to be equal to everyone. So basically, if we detect something that permits equality, we need to tackle it specifically, one on top of the other, on top of the other, till we target all the things that make the society or the processes unequal or inaccessible.
Thank you very much. I would like to now go to Akiko. There's a specific question for Akiko on our chat box from Dr. Unati. How are young people with hallucinations and delusions with paranoid features coping in this pandemic? Has medication been helpful? I can imagine it's hard listening to voices and have to be indoors, more especially in the beginning of the pandemic. So this is referring to a very specific situation, Akiko, and they're expecting that perhaps you can shed some light on this.
I'm not sure I can, but I'll try. So I think at the most basic level, pandemic or no pandemic, people and young people experience things like voices or visions in really, really different ways. And for some people, it can be a positive experience. For some people, it can be really frightening, really terrifying. And for other people, it's neutral or it's mixed, it's complicated. And I think that applies outside of a pandemic as well as during one. So actually, if you go to the first link that I posted, that was posted for me in the chat or the Q&A, the Hearing Voices page link, there's some really interesting examples within that of people who found their voices and visions really comforting during the pandemic, and other people who found them worse. So I don't think we can generalize is the answer. I think medication will help some people. It can kind of take the edge off voices for some people. For some people, it can get rid of them completely. For other people, it has no effect, and the side effects of medication make them worse. So it's a really short answer to a really big question, but perhaps that takes us somewhere.
Thank you, Akiko. Another question that is directed to you is someone with bipolar disorder, and they're asking how to reach out to friends and ask for support without bordering them. So I think they're asking about somebody who is living with bipolar disorder. How can they reach out to friends? How can they access support without being subjected to marginalization and stigmatization?
Yeah, I mean, that's super hard, isn't it? Because, for me on a personal level, feeling like I'm going to burden someone else is, makes me feel worse. And it kind of like, it makes the thing bigger, and feelings of guilt, etc., aren't super helpful. So I think it can be a constant thing. I think it will depend on the individual, but I think for a lot of people, being able to connect with other people who experience similar stuff can be really helpful. So peer support can be a way around that. And obviously, within peer support, that there's something about if you belong to a group, you're not just it's not just focused on one individual, but it's a little bit more spread out, and that can help with some of this, but it's complicated.
Thank you, Akiko. Building on your answer, I also want to go to Gabriel. Gabriel Haredia, I hope you are here with us now live. And Akiko has spoken about the importance and the effectiveness of peer-to-peer support now. And I would like to really hear from you what your experience has been through your organization, META, giving this type of peer-to-peer support to other young people dealing with mental health challenges. Over to you, Gabriel.
Okay, thank you for the question. I will want my help. Antonio, ¿puedes ayudarme?
Sí, puedo ayudarte. ¿Qué necesitas?
Recién me habían hecho una pregunta.
Sí, que te la traduzca. ¿Cómo ha sido tu experiencia con el soporte de pares a través de Meta? ¿Qué puedes decirnos al respecto?
Bueno, últimamente en las reuniones que tuvimos con Meta, virtualmente, de manera virtual, estuvimos apoyándonos con gente que nos asistía a las personas con discapacidad. ¿Puedes decir eso?
Okay. Gabriel said, lately in the virtual meetings we are having with Meta via Zoom, we are getting assistance from people who are helping us to cope with the stuff we are facing. Particularly, I think he referred during the pandemic. If you need me.
Tuvimos reuniones y bastantes actividades recreativas para compartir entre todos.
Okay. We are having meetings and plenty of recreative activities specifically for sharing amongst ourselves. I will elaborate in that we are opening spaces to talk amongst ourselves, to figure out how's everyone feeling, how's everyone getting affected. And we are also organizing game nights on Fridays, just so that everyone can relax for a bit and cope with the stress in that way.
Thank you very much, Gabriel, for sharing those experiences with us. We are over time, so I'm not going to take any more questions to answer in person, but we have a very important question on civic engagement of young people with disabilities. And the question is, what are the barriers for civic engagement for young people with disabilities, and sort of what are the solutions for those barriers? And I will really ask our speakers and experts to try to answer these questions in the Q&A box and in the chat box. And I see that Toby has also answered the question on education on the chat box as well. So please continue to stay engaged and keep sending us your questions, comments, and feedback. The last segment is now, and we have Dido. You already heard from Dido earlier when he answered two of our questions. He is a young disability advocate and psychologist from Bulgaria. And Dido will share with us his experience as to how he has dealt with the pandemic and its mental health impacts. And he will also take us through a simple guided meditation that we can use as a powerful tool for our own internal resilience and calmness. Thank you, Dido, for doing this session with us, and over to you.
Well, I think now you can hear me. Thank you, Jayatma, for having me and for organizing this amazing event. Actually, this time of pandemic, as we already heard, is very challenging to every one of us. And actually, the first thing that we need to tackle is not how to be alone, because as we already know, with persons with disabilities like us, we know how to be alone. But actually, the first thing that we need to assure for ourselves is actually how we can create a structured day for ourselves, because a structured day ensures something which happens every day. It's for sure, and it doesn't create any more tension, and also it keeps us moving. So the first thing that we need to do is to give our brain a space where to get more stronger and where to get calmer. So how we do this? Well, as a psychologist, I can give you a ton of ways to do it, but actually one of the fastest way to do this is through imagination and recreation in your mind. And one of the fastest way to learn to do this is through mindfulness exercises. And let me take you from one perspective of it. So now, let us try to close our eyes. It's important not to strain our eyebrows. If you can close your eyes, it's fine. If you can't quite close them like me, it's also fine. And now we are concentrating on the way that we are breathing. We need to feel the air coming inside of our bodies through our nostrils or our mouth, and we need to experience the air. The air comes inside of us. It may be a bit warm, or dry, or humid. Do you feel it? It enters your nostrils, goes down your body, and now we start to count down from 10 to 1. 10, 9, 8, and we breathe. 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We are breathing and keeping our mind on the fact that we need air everywhere inside of our bodies. We feel it entering us and affecting our thinking. We inhale, the air is coming through us and gets away our tension. We breathe in and the breath takes away our stress. We breathe in and again tension is released. And now we need to think about our head and breathe. We go down to our shoulders and we exhale. We go down to our chest and our back and we breathe. Go to our stomach, down our hips and legs and feet, and we feel the tension and stress leaking away from our toes and our fingers. And now let's get back to our head and we imagine some water. We breathe in and try to imagine the water. It's a clear one with a bit of sparkle in it, and it drops in our head. We breathe in, we exhale our thinking, and more drops of water. Inhale and exhale. And now the water is slowly pouring into our brain. We imagine the water. It may be a bit cold or soft or warm. We inhale and exhale, and the water prevents our thoughts and tension to go back. We observe the water entering our head, washing away our thinking, troubles, concerns. We concentrate on the air which coming inside us and the water which is pouring. It washes away our thinking, and we observe how the air and water are together inside of our bodies. We inhale and exhale. And now we are imagining the water slowly pouring out to our bodies. With it, it carries all the calmness and the relaxation. It stores in our chest, in our hands, in our knees, and we start to breathe more energetically. And now we count from 1 to 5, feeling the last drops of the water with all of its calmness reaching our joints. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. How you feel? I hope okay. So thanks.
Thank you very much, Dieter, for taking us through that exercise. I hope for those who are starting their day, this will be a great way to start their day. For those who are ending their day, this will be a great ending to their day. And I hope that we can all practice. So thank you so much once again for sharing this amazing technique with us. With that note, I am going to conclude our webinar and wish everyone a safe and healthy time. Please note that the recording of this session will be available, as well as the supporting materials. Answers to your questions will also be posted on my website. So you can go to www.un.org/UN-Youth-Envoy. Sorry, I said that wrong. www.un.org/youth-envoy. And you can just search UN Youth Envoy on Google, and you can find my website where all this information, including the recordings and the answers to your questions, will be posted very soon. Thank you everyone for joining. Since this is the last one of our webinar series, I want to thank wholeheartedly our partners, UNICEF and WHO, those who have been behind the scenes, behind the screens actually now, helping us take this webinar series forward. I hope that we were able to support, help elevate the importance of the mental health agenda for all young people. We've touched upon young people with disabilities, we've touched upon young indigenous people, we've touched upon young LGBTIQ people, and tried to assess so many issues that young people are going through right now, from mental health challenges to being caregivers, to advocating for better mental health policies and programs. So I couldn't think of a better way to wrap up our webinar series. Thank you so much for joining us. Please stay engaged, please stay connected, and let us know how we can improve this work and work in partnership with all of you as we move forward. Thank you. Stay safe, stay healthy, everyone.